Hey, I'm going to talk about pricing illustrations today, something I've covered in the past, but I've got plenty more to say. Videos have taken a bit of a back seat as I've been doing some coaching. I'll put a link to that below if you'd like to know more. I've also spent the last year writing a book, which has been intense. If you subscribe to my newsletter through my website, I'll be sending out some sneak previews very soon. And if you know any illustrators who might find this channel useful, it would be great if you could share it or follow me on Instagram at the Illustrators Guide, where I post shorter reels and tips. Okay, self-promotion over. Let's get to the good stuff. Pricing your work does get easier as time goes on because you learn what different kinds of clients are willing to pay and also how much work different kinds of projects require, but that's no use to you right now. So when you have no data to inform your prices, you have to treat pricing as an experiment. There aren't really any right answers, there's only what the client is willing to pay and what price you are willing to do the job for. A book or a website can't give you the right price for a particular illustration project. There are a few out there that have prices listed in them, but they can only ever be a general guide. A book doesn't know your financial circumstances or how complex and time-consuming your style is, and while it may have accumulated some data from other clients, it doesn't know what your client's budget is. Don't get me wrong, there can be a useful starting point if you have no data of your own, but if you quote $800 for a full-page magazine illustration, that would be way too high for some and way too low for others. Every client has a different budget. You might lose the occasional job by quoting too high, but probably more often leave money on the table by quoting too low. Because there's no one-size-fits-all pricing model, every illustrator has to figure it out as they go. This means making mistakes, which is frustrating. But if you can see these early projects as an experiment, every miscalculation becomes useful data for the next project. So keep track of all the prices you give to clients and start accumulating your own personal data for your own pricing guide. I've said this before, but it's worth repeating. Always ask the client if they can share what their budget is. Some of them will tell you, which makes it really easy. Some of them know but won't tell you because they're shopping around for the right price, and some of them don't know because they're scoping out what the project might cost and if it's even feasible. I mentioned earlier that there's a price clients are willing to pay. If you ask what the budget is, the client might tell you, but they probably won't tell you what the maximum they're willing to pay is. If they have $500 in the budget, they might tell you $400. They reserve that extra 20% in case any revisions are needed, and they expect some illustrators to negotiate. But if the illustrator doesn't negotiate and the project goes smoothly, they just saved $100. This works both ways. You might quote $900 for a project, but you'd probably do it for $800. It's a two-way street. The client has a number they want to pay and a number they are willing to pay, and you have an ideal price and an acceptable price. Over time, as you accumulate data for your own personal pricing guide, you'll get to know what's expected and reasonable and what's too high or too low. The more data you have, the easier it becomes, but it's not a worthwhile experiment if you don't record your data. I have a whole video on pricing for magazines because that's where a lot of new illustrators get started. And there's a lot of reasons why illustrators start in editorial. It's a quick way to learn the ropes, and the projects are short. You can prove yourself as a professional before moving on to more challenging projects. And most editorial projects are fairly low fees, so they can take a chance on a newer artist because there's not as much risk. More complicated projects with higher budgets are less likely to be offered to a new illustrator because there's more money on the line and more risk. So you're less likely to be put in a position where you, as a beginner, have to give a price for an advertising campaign or something like that. If you do find yourself in that situation, the Association of Illustrators is going to be a great resource for helping you work that out. They may not tell you exact prices, but they can guide you to submitting a fair price for your circumstances. You could ask a more experienced illustrator for help pricing your work, but the price they would give isn't necessarily the price you should give. They've got more experience and can ask for more because they have the proof that they're worth a higher price. The client can see from their portfolio that they'll get a lot of value from working with an experienced illustrator, but a beginner doesn't have that evidence yet to back up a high price. You definitely shouldn't be giving the lowest price you can. More on this in a second, but experienced illustrators who can offer a client more value can charge more, just like a professional singer or footballer or carpenter can charge a higher price than an amateur. A client who is willing to work with a new illustrator has almost endless options, and there's no reason for them to pay experienced professional rates to work with an inexperienced illustrator. If they wanted to pay those rates, they'd just work with a more experienced artist. You've got to give prices appropriate to your level of skill and experience. That doesn't mean that these clients want to work with the cheapest option though. What they want is good value for their money. If the client receives a bunch of quotes from illustrators for a job, they usually won't go for the most expensive, and they probably won't go for the cheapest. They'll pick from the middle because it's a good trade-off between price and perceived quality. The price you give is affected by all the other prices the client receives. The highest quote will always seem too high, and the lowest suggests they won't receive good quality work. Aiming to be the lowest priced option may win you some clients, but a client you win by having the lowest price is not a client with long-term value. As you get more experienced, those clients can't or won't want to work with you anymore. They just want cheap work, and that's not a good client. And a low-paying project doesn't necessarily mean an easier project. The clients who want the cheapest work are almost always the ones who complain the most and make unreasonable demands. Apart from that, you're setting yourself up for a very difficult life by aiming to be the cheapest option. There is an endless supply of people, not to mention stock images and AI that can do the job cheaper than you. So you probably can't charge the highest rates as a beginner, but you definitely shouldn't be aiming to be too low either, because you'll represent yourself as being low quality and low value. So where does that leave us? Well, the sweet spot, the ballpark, somewhere in the middle. Aim to get your price in the right ballpark. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can afford to be a little bit too high because the client can negotiate with you. And if it's a little bit too low, sure, you're leaving some money on the table, but you're not representing yourself as a low quality option. You'll still be taken seriously. And if you can figure out where the ballpark is, then you can make your best guess. And that's what pricing comes down to a lot of the time, guesswork. Even at the highest levels, there's an element of that. But the more experienced you get, the more accurate your guesses will be. If a client starts negotiating with you on a price that you've given, that means you nailed it. It's a good sign. It means they're interested in working with you and they're taking you seriously. I've got a couple of different pricing models that I've found useful when giving a quote. First is the 3 Ps, which I've spoken about before. Any project you take on should have 2 of these 3 Ps. Price. If you're getting a good price for a job and you're going to enjoy working on it, it doesn't matter if no one will ever see it. Pleasure. If you'll enjoy working on a project and you'll get some great promotional opportunities from it, then you can afford to do it at a reduced price. Promotion. If you'll get great promotional opportunities from a project and you're going to be paid really well, it might be worth doing, even if you won't enjoy the work that much. The second is sometimes called the unobtainable triangle. If a client needs the work doing quickly and cheaply, they can't expect high quality. If a client wants high quality quickly, they can't expect it to be cheap. And if a client wants high quality for a low price, it's probably going to take a while. It's unobtainable because an illustrator trying to do all of these things at the same time, working fast at high quality for a cheap price, would run out of money or burn themselves out very quickly. So, to sum up, treat your pricing as an experiment and record your data. Aim to get your price in the right ballpark and look forward to the client negotiating with you because it's a good sign. And finally, once you've started accumulating your pricing data, don't keep it to yourself. If you work in a studio or have friends who are illustrators, share what you learn with them and ask them to share theirs in return. Having your own data is useful, but having the combined data of a group of other illustrators benefits you all, and you'll all learn quicker and advance faster. Sorry I don't have a magic formula for you. Calculating an hourly rate is a useful rule of thumb when you don't have much data to go on, but an hourly rate is about what you need to survive. It doesn't factor in what the work is worth to a client or any specific details about the project. You're not just charging for your time, you're charging for what the work is worth to your client. What it costs you to create the work is largely irrelevant. What's more important is what benefits the client is getting from the work that you provide. If your illustrations are going to be used to make the client a lot of money by attracting new customers or helping to sell high-value products, then your price should be high. But if it's an article for a regional magazine or an internal company presentation that only 100 people are going to see, it's not that valuable. So those kinds of jobs don't pay that much. So always think about what benefits the client is getting from your illustrations, but don't forget to ask what their budget is first. See you soon.